Greetings and good afternoon, and a hearty warm welcome to Crystal Ball Gazing 2019 and beyond. In its third edition, started in 2016. Before I get into the event, let me present the two hosts for you. One is Mahindra, needs no introduction here. The other is RM Next, an entire contingent here from my community of risk professionals. RM Next is an informal association of risk management professionals, and we have now hit a number of 150 risk professionals in this club from over 50 corporations in India, with a lot of emphasis on non-financial firms. That should soothe the nerves of economists like Sachin on my right. This actually started as an idea over idli and upma between Govindan, Venkatesh and myself. In this very room, 2 years ago, it got its name RM Next, and since then we've been building some momentum to it. And like all good firms, like all good clubs, it's important to understand the network effect, which is either you network or you not work. So we are networking and building partnerships and alliances. We have built 2 alliances to date. The first is with BCI, a firm that focuses, an institution that focuses on business continuity. It's a UK-based global organization which has presence in India, an India chapter, and within India, multiple city chapters. Anand Sampath is representing BCI. Thank you, Anand, for being here. The second partnership is with RIMS, which is Risk Management Society, a New York-based organization with presence around the world. They do certification programs. So RM Next is an alliance with them to develop India-based content for risk management and for certification by RIMS. RIMS is represented by Mr. Roop Kumar, who's here. And Roop Kumar subsequently will be a panelist as well on the second one. Coming to the subject on hand, this is a subject that we want to build a tradition out of as RM Next and Mahindra. Traditions are built over a period of time when a habit is repeated by a large number of people. So as much as it is, you will see a lot of common faces amongst the panelists over the years. What is heartening to building a tradition is the audience that I see year after year, almost a common set of people, and people who come and get on to this club for the next year in succession. So building this tradition is as much each one in this room responsibility as it is of this panel or the governing council of RM Next. So my appeal to you is, now that you're part of this, please stay on this and help build this into something that we can all say with pride that we created this event and we have seen it grow over the years. Why do we do this event? It's very easy for risk professionals to get underground or under a coconut shell or get lost in details on compliance, regulations, controls, variances. It is important for risk managers to break away these shells and look at the world outside in. What are the trends emerging? What are the scenarios likely to play out? What do we need to worry about? What are the knowns? What are the known unknowns? What are those unknown unknowns that can come and bite you on the buttocks? It is important that risk managers consider these issues. So crystal ball gazing is an event where we try to get that external expert perspective, or what we call the outside-in perspective, and then have a panel discussion amongst the risk professional to make sense out of it and share with us how do we position risk management to handle all of these externalities. So that's really what we're trying to do in this event, and I'm so glad you're part of it. To set the context for today, as opposed to 2017 or 2016, I think we live in my view, one of the most complex phases of mankind. To the extent that a question that can be asked, will mankind survive 2050? will our entire prediction on climate change be so wrong that it's actually happening faster than we thought? Everybody is worried about climate change is not an issue or maybe happening slower than we expect, but is it a likelihood that it can happen faster than we think? You're seeing conflicts between nations, you're seeing conflicts within nations. Conflicts between nations is dictated by trade, dictated by geopolitical influence that these countries can have on each other. Conflicts within countries is around ideologies. So while everybody embraces democracy, you have this conflict between strong, powerful leaders in democracy versus a distributed liberal voice in the society. And they are competing for space out here. How would this conflict play out? So on one hand, if you take, say, our own country, if I look at the top line numbers of GDP, of inflation, of savings, they all tell a very good story. But if I peel the skin and look below, we have a lot of headwinds across different sectors, including socially. Customer sentiment has taken a punch. So it's in this context today that we have this panel here to share with us their readings of the outside world. So in the first session, which I call Outside in Perspective, we have the gentleman, apologies for being an all-male panel, we should change this next year. We will have an Outside in Perspective. It will be led by Andrew. Andrew represents Control Risks in India. His firm, which is a global consulting firm, will put out the top 10 risks, and he will present this in about 15 minutes. Following that, we move to Sachin Shukla, who's the chief economist of Mahindra, to give his perspective on the macro factors, both globally and in India. We then move to Amit Bhandari, a fellow at Gateway House, who would give his perspective on geopolitics, oil and the energy sectors as they are playing out. And finally, to our superstar, Navneet Munot, to talk about financial markets. That's what eventually all of us relate to very closely. My partner in crime here is the corporate treasurer of Mahindra, Nikhil Soni. He and I will jointly moderate the session. And I have Amaya and Manaswini to help me with the timing. My request to the panel, when you see an amber, it's a caution. And when you see a red, it's a hard stop. We don't want bells and buzzers. Let's keep that out here. Without any further ado, I'm going to get started with Andrew.
Thank you very much. So I'll start by saying I'm very sorry. Normally I'd move around the audience like a bouncing ball, but today I'm going to be sitting down so the cameras can keep an eye on me. I need to move closer to the microphone. It's very rare anyone tells me to speak up. So I want to say thank you very much to everyone for having me here today. I've been asked to cover the world in 15 minutes, so that's going to be a nice quick run. I think it is fair to start by paraphrasing an old saying, may you live in interesting times, because at the moment, that's really what we're doing. I'm going to start, basically we're working our way through the 10 trends that we see for 2019, starting with what is nicely called the New Cold War. I think this is very much beginning with the geopolitical landscape, but we see the sort of burgeoning US-China rivalry across the spectrum of political, diplomatic, economic, military, ideological domains as potentially a new Cold War. If you look at the sort of how we draw that conclusion, you look at the conclusion drawn from perhaps some of the speeches that have been given. You look at a speech delivered by US Vice President Mike Pence in October, drawing comparisons to Churchill's 1946 Iron Curtain speech, Reagan's 1987 Berlin Wall speech. You see some of the tropes of the Cold War still holding a degree of currency. For example, the sort of peace through strength motto, and that renewed fixation on spycraft that we see a lot of at the moment, and we'll come back to in a little while. It is also the situation that this kind of us v them situation remains relatively popular with the US voters. They're concerned about China's economic and geopolitical rise over the past 10 years, and especially as a result of the trade war that we've been seeing arise recently. And at a deeper level, it really does reflect a broader sort of clear geopolitical narrative, ending this US strategic drift and ad hoc crisis management around situations like the Arab Spring, the Ukraine and North Korea, which has really been since the global financial crisis, which we see as hearkening the end of the post sort of Cold War world order, and we're in a transition phase at this point in time. I've hedged my bets here. You'll see that there's question marks on what actually leads into the next world order. Not going to predict that right at the moment, but what we are seeing right now is that transition period. I think the implication of this is, while the outcome is as yet is undetermined, geopolitical competition is not going away. If anything, we're going to see rivalries escalate, and we're going to see additional implications in the economic and geopolitical arenas. It's going to be increasingly difficult for businesses to segregate business, national security, and ideology. If I move on to the ideological agendas, which is the second trend, perhaps not the most complimentary slide, let's say. I think this one is relatively self-explanatory in a sense. You know, we've tended to think that current geopolitical rivalries are fairly realist and sort of lack the ideological overlay that characterized the historical Cold War. The US-China rivalry, however, does dramatize how ideological red lines are beginning to implicate businesses. Both of those jurisdictions, both those countries, are working to impose an ideological agenda on the international business community as a condition of market access. You can look at some examples there around things like Taiwan, Palestine, Israel, which I'm not going to go into for the interest of time at the moment. One of the challenges, and this is where the slide comes in, that is on at the moment when you say, are countries buying into this, is that for the US there's been a bit of a collapse in international confidence in US political leadership. So that in itself is an interesting shift, and I have some more statistics on that aren't up here, again, in the interest of time. So we are in this situation where the appeal from the US side is significantly reduced on where it was several years ago, and no obvious ideological successor is present. So really what we see there is business caught in the crossfire. The trade war is already sort of falling disproportionately upon multinational enterprises, particularly those that do export manufacturing in China or sell commodities to China. Governments on both sides are likely to continue putting pressure on business to get with the program and to make economic concessions in the name of patriotism. The next one up, when it returns, is state capitalism. So very much the subtext to the US-China rivalry is around the appropriate and fair role of the state in the economy. So that remains the subtext of the challenge right now. So first and foremost, the US position here has somewhat become, if you can't beat them, join them. In addition to sort of protectionist trade restrictions, many of which have been cloaked in national security considerations, the administration is picking winners in energy, industrial, manufacturing sectors, including through selective deregulation. Second and more fundamental, this is occurring in the post-global financial crisis era, in which the sort of laissez-faire capitalism, the so-called Washington consensus, has been broadly delegitimized. The IMF, amongst others, have recognized that governments have an important role to play in economic management. The slide here is around the fact that there are 80 new national industrial strategies that have been implemented over the past 5 years. And industrial policy now covers 90% of the global economy. So 25% of those address positioning for the next industrial revolution. Again, from an implications perspective, companies need to be prepared for government to be more interventionist and selective, even when it's liberalising the economy and opening up to foreign trade and investment. The global policy environment is more hospitable to intervention, and nationalism may ultimately demand it. Moving to the next trend, fraying global norms. This slide actually only portrays 24 hours in the media today. There is a degree of what can I get away with occurring in international interactions. There's a loss of consensus around what issues are basically more important in regards to sort of the conduct of countries at the international stage. And frankly, business is playing an increasing role in defining which issues are actually important. What we're seeing to some extent, I've heard some of my colleagues talk about as a degree of broken windows theory in geopolitics. So a failure, an unwillingness or inability to uphold global norms can actually be making violations more likely, or at least more brazen. From that perspective, it's interesting to look at this in terms of kind of changes to democracy versus corruption. A lot of my work hinges around issues of ethics and corruption. And data actually shows that where there are changes in regards to democracy, for better or worse, you see a shift in regards to the ability of that country to control corruption. And the capacity to control corruption is then highly correlated against government effectiveness, the rule of law, and regulatory quality. So the implication here being that the fraying of global norms, such as what we've seen here in regards to Saudi Arabia in recent months, can pose significant reputational and political risks to business. Institutional quadrails are less effective without the accompanying behaviours, and companies need to be prepared to respond to and be more resilient to shocks and surprises as governments, as well as state-sponsored actors such as rogue killers, push the boundaries of acceptable international behaviour. Which brings us to progressive trade. Not everything I'm going to say today is woefully depressing. I realise as we work our way through this, I'm saying a lot of negative things. I think one of the really interesting strands that we're seeing emerging is this progressive trade, which brings progressive ambitions, you know, in new or expanded chapters on human rights, labour rights, gender equality, indigenous rights and the environment to the global trade stage. For Canada, this is actually one of the explicit pillars of their foreign policy, number 3, I believe. You see, for example, up here on the stage, the people there from the CPTPP, and you're seeing more use of multilateral and plurilateral mechanisms to enshrine such progressive trade rights in the global economy. This seems to be a pushback against that erosion to global norms. In regards to how that it will impact upon business, by writing progressive values into trade agreements, there is likely to be new requirements imposed upon international business. Companies in some contexts, if they're not already there, are going to need to ensure their strategies and their ethics are aligned, and not just their compliance function, I might stress, are aligned to the jurisdictions in which they are operating. Moving to the next one, which is trend number 6, shift in normative powers. And probably most relevant to, I think, everyone in this room, which is it's becoming ever more important in this era how multinational companies and not just governments react to these changes. It's long been the case that corporate responsibility provides essential self-regulation and risk management in locations where official regulation is often weak or non-existent. Corporate responsibility organisations and instruments form a kind of deterritorialised global corporate ethics structure built around the values of a liberal world order. And the slide here is a thank you to various organisations for having pulled out of the Future Summit in Saudi after the killing of Khashoggi. I would note there a quote from Larry Fink of BlackRock. They withdrew from the Future Investment Initiative, but had already said several months before, when referring to the millennial market, that people want to associate themselves with a brand that they believe in. Employees are more interested in working for a company that they believe in. You hear an awful lot in the contemporary era about millennials. I think possibly by dates I might be one. But fundamentally, what is sort of coherent across that group is a view that they are less patriotic, more distrustful, more economically optimistic, better educated, more tech savvy, less religious, and more socially conscious than prior generations. Much of that research is actually done by non-millennials, I would say, so I feel I'm allowed to say that without offending anyone. From an implications perspective, business is global, so values need to be as well. For companies to be successful internally and externally, they've got to consider the position of social and political issues. I'm going to move a little quicker now because I've seen an orange flag. Political extremisms at trend number 7. This is rapidly going to become me calling a horse race. This slide is relatively self-explanatory. You see geopolitical competition empowering non-state actors. As a result, you also see that political populism provides cover for violent extremism. And you see that fragile states continue to be soft targets and safe havens for that extremism. I can touch a bit more on that later on in the session, but I would say that while we see political extremism as a persistent problem and still an acute security threat in many contexts, we actually do think it is somewhat declining as a threat to business more generally. Late cycle economies, so the economic outlook. I know that I'm stealing thunder from the various economists who are going to present later on, so I'm going to come through this pretty quickly. Realistically, we see here 5 key things: populism and economic nationalism, trade and investment wars, emerging market debt, monetary policy normalization, and rising commodity prices. And I know from a stimulating discussion over lunch that if I steal all of that, the economists will hunt me down somewhere around the building. So we're going to move right along. Trend number 9, upcycling economies. And I think here it's interesting to note the sort of globalization point, looking at the fact that globalization did actually achieve a lot, regardless if you're pro or anti-globalization. In the era of sort of globalization coming to the fore, you needed low-cost, instantaneous communications. We've gone with the fax machine, which I hope everyone remembers. You needed cheap, reliable transport to get your goods around the world between production centers and final customers. And you needed more computation and better models for accurate forecasting on procurement, production, and sales. Why we've gone with software that's a few years old now, I'm not entirely sure. I would say that you see in the value here that about 60% of the global GDP, even if you've seen a slowdown in globalization, total trade in goods and services is now equivalent to about 60% of global GDP. So you can't argue with the globalization. I'm going to skip to the last one because I've seen the red flag, which is data is the battlefield. You've all heard the cliches. Data is the new oil, data is the battleground of the 21st century, data is the rocket fuel that fuels the ship. Ultimately, this is very true, and we'll touch, I think, again on some of this as we move through the next session on how different data protection regimes are complicating life for business around the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks much, Andrew. I haven't seen somebody provide a dissertation of so many contradictions over 15 minutes. So on one hand, I thought you were predicting chaos because every institution of yore was being challenged. And in the same tone, you kind of gave the light at the end of the tunnel to say that purpose is going to be the driving force for the millennial. That just plays into my senior colleague, Mr. Parthasarathy's favorite pitch of talking about churn between the two extreme views, and out of that something new will emerge. So between chaos and purpose, there is going to be a churn, and that will deliver something good. And as compulsive optimists, we will hope that it is a net positive value. So you've got the global trends of risk from a risk consultant's perspective. and he was very watchful about not treading on the toes of the economists. Respecting that, let's get the economist in before with his dancing shoes and talk about the global and India macro trends. Sachin.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It was you listed down 10 risks already, so I need not talk about more. One thing I want to get away with before I start is that the economy depends as much on economists as the weather depends on the weathermen, right? So whatever I'm going to say about the global economy and the domestic economy, I think I've got 6 minutes. For the globe, I would say this is going to be, 2019 is going to be a year of discretion and not valor. We are seeing the risks that we've had only on Twitter actually materializing in real life in black and white. We'll have a situation where Trump probably is going to impose 25% tariffs on $250 odd billion worth of Chinese goods. So all of that Twitter talk is going to get actionated, and therefore this is something that will make the whole world watchful. Andrew talked about how the world is doing well in terms of trade and things like that. I think it will get slower as we move forward. Just to summarize the global parts, I will just use 3 English alphabets, A, B, and C. The first is we'll need to watch out for this aging global recovery, right? We've seen world trade do very well, as you said, Andrew. Global economy is growing at a fair clip, 3.6%. Going forward, this Twitter versus actual tariff actionation will impact growth as well as trade. And therefore, the economic recovery that we've seen will probably age, and that is the A bit. The other you also touched upon is the bank balance sheets. We've seen the US Fed actually withdraw close to about $1 trillion already, another 600 billion over the next year. So $1.6 trillion worth of liquidity withdrawal. And this is primary liquidity. And we are not actually factoring in the secondary market and the asset market and the portfolio flows, a bit of it. And that's a huge withdrawal. That's not the only central bank. ECB is also going to join the party. They will withdraw accommodation. So that is the part B for what we need to watch out for. C again is, I think we all know about it. Andrew's spoken about it. China. They've got a big conundrum, 6% challenge for China. We all know that it used to grow at 10, 12% not very long ago. Now they're growing at 6.5, and Andrew doesn't believe even half of it. So we'll have to look for how the Chinese are going to manage that 6% growth. Any slippage below that in the official numbers is going to be seen as a red flag. The other 6% conundrum that China has is not to allow the yuan to depreciate by more than 6%. This year, we're already 6% down. And that's going to be a huge challenge for economies like India in the neighborhood. If the the dragon is going to be depreciating its currency by 6% every year, we've got a huge challenge at our hand. So that sort of completes the global summary. When it comes to India, I think there is one thing that I want to stress about, and we're seeing this every day. That time is gone where we spoke about quantitative measure or the quantity bit in economic variables. What I mean is the entire focus always used to be how fast can the economy grow? Will we be growing at 8% next year? I think those days are gone. We have to quickly shift to quality of growth. And as you started in your opening comments, I think while a lot of talk happens on employment and quality of employment, I think environment is the second thing that we need to watch out for. It doesn't really matter if India grows at 7% versus 8% or 6%. What will matter more now going forward is the quality of growth in terms of environment. 9 out of 10 worst polluted cities are in India. We didn't really think, say 5 years back, that we'll be repeating the mistakes of China. Now remember, China grew at 12, 13% for close to 2 decades. and they had the luxury of actually doing what they did to the environment. India does not have it. I think that's going to be a big shift going forward. So quantitative versus qualitative is what we're going to see on the growth bit. The second part that I want to just talk about is, while I stress upon quantity versus quality, the growth, I think, which comes from the corporates, we are seeing profitless growth for over a decade now. Just look at the earnings growth of a large section of India Inc., right? Earnings growth has actually lagged nominal GDP growth. We are seeing quite a few of these sectors, I mean, large sectors which had huge employment elasticities, etc. They're not really adding any profits. If you don't make profits, you will obviously not add any capex, and therefore your future growth comes under question mark. I mean, couple of sectors that we see have grown really fast. Some of these are aviation and the others. You actually are not seeing them make any money. They're shedding jobs. So I think this is going to be another dimension when we talk about growth. The last bit is dualism that we have. I think the entire policy environment in India has been geared to thinking that India will never have a demand problem. I mean, it's a demand constrained kind of an economy, right? I mean, demand, sorry, I'm saying the opposite. You have enough demand for whatever you produce. I think we need to get our thinking right. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Look at agriculture. 3 years in a row, we produce so much that we just don't know what to do about it. The policy function, response function as we call it, is geared to actually addressing supply shortages. We just can't put our heads together as to what to do with this agricultural glut. Think of electricity. There's enough electricity, but SEBs are not really buying. Look at credit, for example. There's enough money, but there are no, I mean, takers, the right kind of people who you would want to lend to. So I think this is something that I would be watchful of on the domestic side.
That's profit when he finishes ahead of his time, right? So instead of just a trivia, this was the closing statement of Dhirubhai Ambani in the court in Bombay High Court, circa 1988, I think, when he was given 5 minutes and he took only 4 minutes to argue, and he said that's profit. Sachin, Nikhil, do you have a question for Sachin? Quickly.
So the question is always in finance, there is like this time it's different. That these are the dreaded words, because every time you see when oil goes to 85, this time it's different. You see shale coming back. Same way now, if you're talking about the global scenario, first is on trade. I just want to ask you. The G20 draft statement which is there has no reference to anti-protectionism. So do you think there's something to read into that?
See, I think we are, as Andrew started with, we are living in interesting times. What we're seeing is all these multilateral treaties, right? And getting renegotiated. So when you look at some of these statements, I think the focus is clearly shifting on what I can get on the bilateral side. I'll just give you an example, the NAFTA. While it is a tripartite agreement, the emphasis or the focus is purely on America. They've slipped in a condition that you cannot really enter into any kind of a deal, even on the services or the other side, with any country, and that really means China. So I think we have to read between the lines in terms of what comes out in these statements. This is not the only one. You'll continue to see a lot of these treaties getting renegotiated, and we'll have to read between the lines as to what to infer. One thing is very, very clear. It is that particular country first and everything else later. I think that's the subtext in all of these.
Just one another question which I have is on the unprecedented thing which we are having, that is the withdrawal of liquidity in terms of dollar liquidity, which we have already spoken about, and the euro liquidity which will start once ECB starts it. How much do you think this is a risk, real risk for the global economy? Because we have seen the debt build up because of easy money availability, and as the money starts getting pulled out, currencies are going to be impacted, and the debt repayment is going to be impacted. And he has already alluded to it in terms of emerging market debt. So how much of this you think is a real risk for the global economy, and will it impact growth in that sense?
I think that's a fair question, and that is going to guide 2019. Now, if everybody in the room and everybody thinks that liquidity withdrawal is going to be a big problem, the US Fed is actually the source of funds for the rest of the world. ECB is a player at the margin. It will obviously add to the liquidity suction that is happening around the world. But one thing that I would just want to add, while the situation or the scenario looks grim, if you look at Fed behavior over the last 20, 30, 40 years, they do step in the moment asset prices take a hit. And if the US market, so my metric to gauge that will be if such liquidity withdrawal is actually impacting asset markets. If returns are getting hurt, especially the US markets don't really do well, I mean, all kinds of asset classes, the Fed would actually go slow, because even the central banks, if you look at how they've worded their policy statements, they've been extremely and extra careful. I don't really think that if you nurtured something for 10 years with so much liquidity through QE and targeting the yield and stuff like that, whatever monetary tools they've used, you would not want to damage that if you see something going wrong on the asset side. And please remember, the wealth effect is very, very important for the US economy. It's a very, very major variable when it comes to decision making. So I think the Fed would step in, they would go slow, they would signal that they are looking at this, and probably their language will also be geared towards this.
That's the fight between Trump the politician or the campaigner versus Trump the president, where he wants the interest rate. I really like the point about shift in focus from quantity of growth to quality of growth. And this is something I've always raised, that everybody has been betting on demographic dividend, but demographic cost is going to come and bite us. I'm now moving to Amit, who's our geopolitics expert and an expert in the realm of oil and energy. Amit, just a couple of months ago, there was a race to 100. Which will reach 100 first? Would it be the Indian rupee versus the dollar? Would it be oil? Or would it be the petrol price in Bombay? All three have taken a U-turn. How do we make sense out of where oil and energy is going? How come we don't hear of shale anymore? What are the politics in the Middle East that's going to influence this and bring in the Russia element, which is an important player in this? Amit.
Thank you, Vedi. So I think in case of oil, my view is, I mean, this comes with the benefit of hindsight, that the $85 we had about a month and a half back was overdone, and the correction we have now, it fell below 60 last weekend, that is also a bit overdone. Most of the oil industry people that I have interacted with say that $50 to $65 is a price at which they can make money and at which the overall demand growth is not going to be impacted. So 85 was very clearly beyond that point of comfort. The reason oil went to 85 was because the US administration brought back the sanctions on Iran, and on which it has given a waiver to most of the major buyers since. So I feel that this 50 to 65, if the industry people are saying it will be a fair number, I will just take it a little bit upwards to $60 to $70 a barrel, given the distortions that exist in the market. And American sanctions on Iran are a prime example of that kind of distortion. The second part is that what are the risks? Is there a risk that the prices will go up from this point or down? The downside risk comes from global economic growth, which I think Sachin will be more qualified to talk about. I think one of the factors that may contribute to it is the dispute between US and China. On the upside, Middle East is the point at which I think most of the tensions can arise. The two big sources of stress to my mind are Saudi Arabia and Iran, as always. China, of course, to my mind is the third source of stress, and that comes in because of the trade dispute. In case of Iran, the sanctions are not going away. The US, I think the US is now saying that the nuclear agreement concluded with Iran by President Obama was a bad agreement, and that seems to be the case. So it is very unlikely that we will go back to the situation of 1 or 2 years back, where Iran was free to export its oil. at some point these sanctions are going to return, maybe not in an abrupt manner. The second part is in case of Saudi Arabia, the crown prince, not because of the murder of the journalist, but because of other factors, the war he has prosecuted in Yemen and his support for the Saudi support for multiple extremist groups. These, I think, are the issues that can, and the opposition that he has built up within the royal family. So I believe there are a number of other princes who are now opposed to him and would like to see him go. So these are the two issues which to my mind can really push up the price of oil. In case of the US-China trade dispute, if I can take a minute, so that to my mind is the downside risk. I mean, how bad is it going to get? Now, a lot is said about the personality of President Donald Trump, about how he conducts foreign policy on Twitter and how he is volatile. But to my mind, he seems to be acting in a very deliberate and a thought out manner. The US, I think, seems to have clearly identified China as a long-term threat, economic and strategic. Very recently, the US withdrew from the Intermediate Missile Forces Restriction Treaty, which places constraints on some kind of ballistic missiles. And very clearly, the target of that was China. So, even in multiple other ways, many of the Western countries have declared that Chinese state-owned telecom firms, Huawei and ZTE, are no longer eligible to participate in 5G telecom auctions in multiple Western markets. I think Australia, US, Germany also, I believe. Many of the Chinese state-owned companies trying to acquire high-tech or strategic assets in Western markets have been rebuffed in the last few years. So Germany stopped the Chinese company from acquiring a robotics or an AI firm very recently. Australia, I think, stopped a Chinese government-owned company from acquiring a large natural gas pipeline company. And multiple such cases have taken place in the recent past, 2 or 3 years. So very clearly a pushback seems to be coming up against China, against the kind of actions they have taken in the last few years. And these to me seem to indicate that the US-China dispute is not really going anywhere. The trade dispute is just a manifestation of a larger confrontation that is developing. So that I think is something which Andrew had again spoken about. So that's really it, Vedi.
Comments on Russia. You didn't talk about Russia.
Okay, so I think Russia, if we simply look at it as an economic factor, it is not really that much of one. I mean, it is, I think, 11th or 12th largest economy, just about as big as Italy. Russia gets a lot of bad press internationally. I think part of the reason is that a lot of countries are afraid to take on China. But, you know, Vladimir Putin is such a bad person, we can say bad things about him and get away with it. So Russia is a very convenient kind of a fall guy for all the things, all the virtue signaling that a lot of people want to do. Other than that, we had an interaction with a number of Russian government officials and policymakers recently, and one kind of a common theme they had was all of them kind of used that word winter is coming from Game of Thrones. The idea being that Russia feels that it is really surrounded and they are being hemmed in from all sides by the West. So one of the very few allies that they have left on whom they can rely either for money or for investments is China. So they don't like the dependence on China, but they are being pushed towards China because of the constraints that the West is kind of doing, things that the West is doing to them.
So, Amit, just one question,
Right.
and I'm referring to the same shale. For a long period of time, oil remained in a band.
Right.
So, one quick question is, do you think going forward the band will call the tune?
Well, I mean, in case of shale, I'll rephrase the question so that it is more convenient to me. What about shale and and what kind of an impact does it have on the prices? So, you know, how is shale different from conventional oil? I mean, I would not go into how it comes from a different source. The prime difference between a shale field and a regular oil field is that you can get a shale field producing oil or gas within a few weeks or a few months at the most. Whereas if I want to get a conventional oil field into production, it may take a few to several years. Similarly, the production of gas and oil from a shale field declines very quickly. In some cases, 80 to 90% of the hydrocarbon comes out just within a month. So shale really is something which can react very quickly to any price signals that come into the market. And right now it seems that there is a bit of spare capacity still left in the shale business in the US. There are significant shale reserves in Argentina as well, and I have seen reports that they are trying to develop them. So to my mind, shale is something that provides a ceiling, a long-term ceiling to the price of oil. Short-term ceilings can be breached because of geopolitical factors, but if the price is high enough, shale extraction is something that can viably be done. 4 or 5 years back, it was said that shale will be profitable at 70. Below 70, the companies will start shutting down. But very clearly, these companies have been able to bring down their costs. They are profitable. At least cash profits are being generated at $50 a barrel. So the way I would read shale is that it gives you a long-term ceiling on the oil price. If the price stays high enough for enough, this oil will come into the market.
Thanks, Amit. The reason I refer to Navneet as superstar is on the first edition of Crystal Ball Gazing 2016, he made the call on financialization of savings and about how that's going to dramatically change in the country. That event was just a 10 days after the demonetization had happened. And we've seen the mutual fund industry, AUM, grow by about 2.5 times since then. So it's those kind of calls that we make. Last year, Sachin, I remember, make the call about current account deficit coming under pressure in India if oil should move against. That's really what crystal ball gazing is about. It's those calls that we force them to make, and we put Amit on the spot. 50 to 65, we will hold you to it. Demonetization is a bit like communism. The old saying is, at 20, if you're not a communist, you have no heart. At 40, if you're still a communist, you have no head. Demonetization, at the time of announcement, if you did not support it, you were not a nationalist. If you continue to support it, you're not an economist. So that's the kind of effect that it's a useful parking ground, much like what Amit was explaining. It's a useful parking ground to put down a lot of problems, a lot of the stress in the Indian economy. But these are part of longer term changes. So I want you to look really far forward, Navneet, and far forward and tell us what are the long term challenges for the India growth story.
So, after listening to all of these global and domestic risks, if I would talk about financial markets, I would say that the only certainty is continuity of uncertainty. And when I hear the words state capitalism, political extremism, I think the genesis of all of that is we are living in a world where if you're rich, you get bailout. If you're rich, you get bailout. If you're poor, you get handout. If you're somewhere in the middle, you get left out. And that left out feeling is which has led to the rise of Twitter-in-chief of US, Donald Trump, or Brexit, or some of these events. But if you contrast the world with India, something very interesting, that a large part of the world is moving towards anti-immigration, anti-globalization, anti-trade. And look at India, actually, we have been focusing on ease of doing business. The war for like e-commerce is between Walmart and Amazon. I don't think we have stopped. I mean, we have red carpet for everybody in the world, not standing with the pressure from the domestic industry, which structurally I think is very positive for India over a longer period. Before I talk about the risk, I would talk about the opportunity. We should not lose sight when we are talking of so many risks, and I'm going to talk about some of the bigger risks for the India story. Over the last 25 years, and this is the chart I use when I travel abroad, over the last 25 years, nominal GDP has grown at 13%. Corporate profits have grown at 15%. Market capitalization has grown at 16%. That's India for you. I mean, and with the structural forces like democracy, demography, demand, and the most powerful of all, digitization, it gives me a faith that the next 25 years are unlikely to be too different than what it has been over the last 25 years, and that has happened across political regime. But interestingly, because we have, I mean, despite becoming $3 trillion next year, because we have 1.4 billion people, the per capita GDP is still $2,000, and we remain the poorest of the poor country in the world. But this is where US was in 50s, this is where UK was in 60s, Japan was in 70s, Korea, Taiwan in 80s, and China was there just 12, 13 years ago, and they have come to the $10,000. And with those powerful forces, the 4 or 5 Ds that I talked about, I have no doubt in my mind that probably will reach where most of these other countries have reached. It's just a matter of time. Talking about some of the risk, and of course, from a market short-term perspective, people will talk about the unwinding of global monetary policy. Maybe if the crude oil prices go up, maybe the trade war. People think that because our exports are $300 billion out of $2.6, $2.7 trillion of GDP, we won't be impacted. They lose sight of one fact, that if you add India's trade, services and goods import plus services and goods export, trade as a percentage of GDP is higher than China, is much higher than United States. So we are exposed to the world, and I think it's going to impact us. And of course, the monetary policy unwinding over the last 10 years. I mean, this is the 10th anniversary of the global financial crisis. The leverage has not gone out of system. The leverage has only shifted from private balance sheet to the public balance sheet. So $4 trillion of public balance sheet like US Fed, ECB, BOE, BOJ, PBOC and all is $4 trillion to $15.5 trillion. As that get unwound, it will have ripples across all financial markets, and India won't be insulated from that. Talking about some of the, and I won't talk about the politics and all that. I think purely from a markets perspective, and I'm making a very strong call, that doesn't matter. I mean, it will matter for a few days. It will create a lot of volatility, be it the state elections or the general elections in April and May. But if I have to predict where the markets would be in a 1, 3, 5, 10 years, I don't think it makes as much a difference. And markets have perennially been wrong on 2 counts. Number 1, predicting the election outcome. And number 2, even when the outcome is known, so let's say in 2004 when we were circuit down on 17th May because Vajpayee lost the election, the next 5 years was the mother of all bull market. Or in 2009 when we thought Mr. Manmohan Singh is back without a left support and market was up 20% circuit up, and we know the rest is history. And I can give you like the history for last 35 years, right, since 84, 85. So markets have perennially been wrong on that, and we shouldn't pay too much attention of that. I mean, that will provide excellent opportunities. If I have 2 minutes, I'll talk about the 3 biggest risks for India, and they have less to do with energy security or maybe the NPAs or lack of corporate profits, which I think a part is structural, a large part of it is cyclical. But I think the biggest is where some people made a reference, and these are the 3 where I think corporate India pays less attention, but they should pay the most amount of attention. Number 1 is the climate change. You talked about 9 out of 10 cities. I think we are water stressed, and I think we are underestimating the impact of climate change on various things. And it's going to hit us very hard if we don't take the right steps. And it is not only we read about Delhi being a gas chamber. We don't know that actually the smaller towns are as badly polluted as Delhi is. The second is the inequality in a democratic setup, and the reason why there is rise of extreme left and extreme right globally is because, as I said, the left out feeling. I think in India the rising inequality, we have the 3rd largest number of richest people on planet Earth, and we have the largest number of people living in abject poverty. In a democratic setup today, with the WhatsApp and the media and the NGOs and all of that, you can't continue with that. Thankfully, whatever we have done in last few years, in last 7-8 years, right from NREGA to free toilet, free LED bulb, free LPG cylinder, free medical insurance, bank account, pension, I can go on, is what I call India's universal basic income. So we have already implemented a universal basic income in some form. I think corporate sector should support that and should also think how we make the growth more inclusive. I mean, it has to be a capitalism with a conscience, otherwise we are going to pay a very big price. And the 3rd big risk, I think, is our exports this year are $310 billion. In 2012 we were $310 billion. I mean, in last 6 years our exports are flat, and the reason is, and the global trade is rising, and with such a small base we should be much higher. And the reason is, I think, the lack of scale and lack of innovation. Top 500 companies in India spent $3.5 billion on R&D, and just to put that number in perspective, Samsung alone spends $14 billion. I mean, we have no chance on like to really go and compete against. I mean, when let's say China will get impacted because of the tariff war, when the supply chain is likely to move to all the other countries, India is standing the last. I mean, we are losing in textiles to Bangladesh and Vietnam. I mean, look at Cambodia, I look at Malaysia, I look at, like, you know, of course the Korea and Taiwan are like miles ahead. If we don't spend a lot more on innovation and R&D, I think we have a trouble at hand. And more Indians are traveling abroad. More and more of our kids are studying abroad. Our electronics imports will become bigger than, or electronics, or if you are watching a YouTube video or Netflix or whatever, all those will become bigger than oil, and we have no energy security. And if you add up all of that, and if our exports remain at $300 billion, we have a problem at hand. Our IT industry is kind of plateauing. I mean, we have gentlemen from Tech Mahindra, but I look at pharma, we have not been able to build the next big export machine. Of course, tourism and some of the other things we need to think very hard. To me, I think these three. In fact, one, if I can add, and which is, of course, it has happened in last few years, and I don't know whether this is structural. India's household savings rate has fallen from 26% of GDP to 16% of GDP. At $2,000 per capita, there is no country in the history who's got developed or who continued to grow without a much higher savings rate. So we are leveraging a lot more. The households are leveraging a lot more, and we are not saving enough because I think the incomes are not growing, and of course the lifestyle has changed. I think we need to save a lot more, and I think the policy direction has to be in terms of how do we get savings back, because otherwise the large investment needs cannot be met, will remain dependent on foreign capital. Red flag.
You know, you know why he's a superstar? He knows how to appeal to everyone beyond the first row. He said incomes are not rising. But I love the calls you make, Navneet. I really love for a financial markets person to talk about everything other than financial markets is creditable. Rahul is here. He and I know about how he can go to great lengths to talk about how apolitical he is. He'll say it doesn't matter which government is in Delhi, India's growth is.
From a stock market perspective, I said.
Okay, we can go on. May I request someone to give Dr. Goenka the mic? Let's have your comments, sir, and questions for the panel. Up to you, sir.
Well, first of all, let me thank the panelists here for very good insights in each of the areas that you have talked about. I think a lot of what you have discussed today is kind of known in bits and pieces to everybody, and you have brought everything together in one session of 1 hour on the table, which perhaps gives food for thought to everyone, no matter what they're doing and which business or industry they are in. I guess the bigger point for us to deliberate is that in all of these things that we talked about, if you put it all together, the question comes up is how do we run our businesses? We used to talk about a 2x2 scenario planning. Now it has to be 3x3x3x3x3. And I do not know which supercomputer can put all of that together and say, okay, this is what I do for the next 5 years. And planning a budget for 3 years and doing a strategy for 5 years and forecast for 6 months doesn't work anymore. So the chaos that we see, or the uncertainty that we see is here to stay. Nobody can wish it away. It's going to happen. Okay, so in that scenario, how do we manage our businesses? What do we need to do? Is something that we should look at. The other thing that Navneet talked about, the last sort of 2 or 3 points that you made in the end, I think are very forceful points. And sometimes we trivialize the issues that are facing us. And perhaps even government tends to take a shortcut and a convenient view on some of these points, again, no matter which government it is. And these are very difficult problems to address. Whether it is the climate change problem, whether the problem that you talked about in terms of cities, and what was the last thing you mentioned?
Innovation, R&D.
Innovation and R&D. A very important point, innovation and R&D. And the fact that India is losing its competitiveness in almost everything. And it's a very big worry because we are giving, I have said many times that the only big asset that India has is its market. And we're giving away our market for free. How do we really leverage the market just like China did? China basically leveraged their market. And by leveraging their market, they're able to grow their economy, and everybody came on their knees to be in China. We, on the other hand, are becoming too idealistic and saying, come and take it. So if we do not develop the kind of industries that we need to develop, the scale that we need to have, the innovation that we need to have, put in the R&D funds that we need to put in, we'll have the Samsungs of the world come in and take everything away. And that is something that I think requires a lot more than a 1 year cycle of planning or the Prime Minister going out and asking for investment in India. Okay, investment might come, but that does not really solve a problem long term. And this is what worries me the most, that if I was to look at long term, look at where we're headed, where would we be competitive? Where would we be global scale? And even the IT industry, the famed IT industry of India, thanks to Trump, perhaps is going to see very difficult times going ahead. So even that strength that India had and where we had global scale, perhaps will not be there. And I'm not able to find one single thing where I can say clearly India is poised to remain, to become or remain a global leader and something that will drive our economy. Now clearly 7-8% growth that we talk about all the time, GDP growth, we're very proud of and very good it's happening. I sometimes wonder where it's coming from. And when we talk to various people, nobody seems to feel that. When I go into circles and talk to the CEOs, nobody seems to say, I'm feeling good. Why is it that CEOs are not saying, I'm feeling good, when economists are saying we are growing at 7.5 to 8%? And that worries me. And like you said, liquidity is available, there are no takers almost. Credit is available, there are no takers. Where will that money go? Where will the investment come from? And the difficult thing, I think that one of you mentioned that, I think you started off saying that the growth is happening without profit.
Sachin was talking about.
Sachin said that growth is happening without profit. And that's a very worrisome signal, because if you're growing without profit, then you will not invest in future. And if you don't invest in future, then jobs won't happen, and then the investment won't happen. And one thing that none of you touched about, which to me is a problem that is as big as climate, as big as innovation, is jobs. India needs jobs. India needs jobs very badly. We need 1 million new jobs every month. And every development that is happening is taking jobs away. No matter how much we talk about Industry 4.0 is going to bring new kind of jobs, I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that India is ready for those new kind of jobs. And even the smallest investment, like in our plants, we can take 4 jobs away by investing 1 crore. And that will happen as the wages go up. We will invest that 1 crore and take 4 jobs away. Where will jobs come from? And I'm really worried, because the agriculture cannot support the kind of population it's supporting today. It can never bring prosperity if it has to support 40-45% of Indians through agriculture. Never can bring prosperity. It cannot support more than 15% population long term. The remaining 25% who are today supported by agriculture have to be supported by industry and services. And the jobs are not there. So that is my big worry, in addition to climate, in addition to innovation. I guess I talked quite a bit, so I'll stop here.
Maybe I can.
Yeah. Before you react, Navneet, I think you've got a lot of heads up to. I'm looking at the panelists for the next session. I don't need to make opening comments. He's already done that, so you know what the questions are coming. I'm going to request Navneet and Sachin to react to some of those observations. Particularly, I'm also worried about jobs and inequity in distribution of wealth.
So as Sachin mentioned, I think he briefly touched upon, but the other point on why the growth is not felt, maybe because out of the 4 cylinders, consumption, government expenditure, private capex and exports, it's only the consumption which has been firing. And also the government expenditure, a part of it is like 7th pay commission or maybe whatever, the food subsidy and all, which is also driving the consumption only. That is also not going the way it should go into, let's say, the infrastructure building. So because 2 or 3 cylinders are not firing enough, and that's why you don't feel that growth. And also I think something between the nominal and the real, because in India's inflation has come down significantly, if you are used to that, the numbers that I quoted earlier, 15% over a long period, and suddenly like 7% plus 2-3% inflation, so you're talking of like 9%, but psychologically you look at the nominal figure in the corporate balance sheet. And on the profit part, I would say a part of it, you are right, is actually structural. The decline in corporate profitability, and I had this view a few years back that India's ROE, which we have seen in the previous cycle, we will not see that next time, simply because with the disruption in the way of doing business, disruptions in technology, disruptions in consumer behavior, disruptions in logistics, all of these are killing a lot of profit pools structurally. Part of it is cyclical, which will get rebound. So let's say State Bank of India has a 34 lakh crore balance sheet, which had a loss last year. Next year, if they go to 1% return on assets, they will have a 34,000 crore profit. They will change the Nifty profits. 1 or 2 or 3 of these names will change the aggregate Nifty profit. So part of it is cyclical, which will get addressed. On jobs, I would say, I think it's a myth that manufacturing and Make in India can create jobs, simply because it's a myth. I think it can create jobs simply because the new age manufacturing, if we have to be competitive worldwide in the Internet of Things and robotics and 3D printing, we cannot manufacture the way we have been. I mean, you know it far better than that. I shouldn't say much. I think the jobs have to create it on the services side. So India's biggest hope, if we get it right, I was in Rishikesh yesterday, and it's a shame what we are doing with that. I mean, I think we can get 1 million people in Rishikesh. This is my view. Varanasi should get a lot many more people than what Kyoto or some of those cities get. We get less tourists a year than Bali, than Thailand. I mean, it's a shame on India. If we get this clean India, if we get this whatever infrastructure right, and I think if we focus on this, I think India's tourism can go 10x.
But Navneet, this is well known. I mean, tourism is one of the most under-leveraged opportunity in India. But how will it happen? It cannot happen by some incremental efforts. There has to be a big vision, a long-term big vision, 10 years, not a 1 year, 10-year vision. Varanasi, yes, Varanasi has everything to offer to a tourist, especially coming from outside India.
Maybe I think all of you need to spend more time on Mahindra holidays and think, can you make it 100x? I'm serious, I'm not joking. And because I think it's not only about the global tourism, even the domestic tourism we underappreciate. I mean, each one of our friends, I mean, everybody is like, even 3 days people go to Dubai or New Zealand or somewhere. Why are not people going to Northeast? Why are they not going to Kerala? Why are they not going to Kashmir? Why are they not going to Amritsar? There is no country on planet Earth which offers the things that India offers for the tourist.
Sachin, very quickly before I need to take some questions to the floor. Very quickly, your reactions to Dr. Goenka.
Just one thing. I think the nominal versus real is something that we've spoken about in detail. What happens is if the country is growing 18-19, we've actually halved, and that is why most people can't relate to the 7-8%. The second thing is, I think the services part. Industries actually remained very, very stagnant. We can just look at the export story to corroborate that. And because services was the engine in the early 2000s that added growth and that added jobs. So if you look at IT or pharma or whatever, whichever sectors that created jobs or delta in terms of growth, they have actually come under pressure and industries simply refuse to grow. I think these are the 2 or 3 reasons why nobody can really say that I can feel this 7-8% growth. So I think that kind of answers. And the second is services is the way to go to generate jobs. I mean, there are so many jobs that are under the radar, right? I mean, the industry and the government put together, all kinds of governments, state governments, etc., are still about a fraction of the jobs that we create, just about 9%. So 90% of the jobs are being created elsewhere. So I think services is probably the way to go. And tourism is something that we can obviously debate about. That remains a big challenge.
Before I hand over the mic, the only thing I want to say is that I personally believe and always believe that India's potential is a lot more than what we are realizing.
Absolutely.
And if we can all somehow work together with the goal to fully leverage India's potential, I think we can do a lot more than 7.5-8%. And the double-digit GDP growth is very much within our reach if we can all work with a single objective of how do we get economic growth in India without compromising with the social requirements.
Before I take more questions, I just want to leave something for the panelists too, and we'll come to it in the discussion. He spoke about 2 by 2 giving way to 3 by 3. I think a clear point in there is if you take low, high inflation versus rural, urban, we've not spoken about it. Different parts of India look at inflation very differently. So we need to speak about that. Let's get some questions in.
Yeah, Navneet, if it warms the cockles of your heart, we had enough tourists in Ayodhya, if you followed the media. So we know how to get 25 lakh people when the arrangements for 5 lakhs. So I think we'll pass the message on to Kavinder of Mahindra Holidays. Maybe there's another location we can look for. That's right. But really, kind of coming back to the point on jobs, I think I just want to take Pawan's point forward. I think it's a real serious issue for us because if you look at the cost of robots versus human beings in India, they are narrowing. So I think the day is not far when whoever's running a factory is actually going to economically make the decision to put a robot than a human being. So therefore, what are the roles that human beings can perform? I agree with Sachin, it's on services. Let's take a simple example. Take Swachh Bharat. Today, because of the status of our caste system, a lot of people are not willing to come forward and become janitors. Or let's call them health inspectors, or whatever is a more respectable name that we want to give. So there are professions like this where we can create tens and thousands or hundreds of thousands of jobs. And I think that this is something that we all have to work together because there is a social stigma to some of these kind of services, but which can generate very significant jobs for our people. So how do we do that? How do we give respectability? Can industry come together? Should we think about these things? I think it's high time that we do. My second comment is in terms of academia. I think in India for many years we've never been able to partner well between industry and academia to be able to create the new jobs for the future. It's been very sporadic. It's been driven by altruistic needs of individual corporations who have gone and done that, and I am guilty of that myself. So I think we need to take a much more holistic approach towards that in terms of what are the kind of jobs that really are going to be required going forward in the future. Maybe it is about training the robots. Maybe it is about writing chatbots. Maybe it's about other things. But we need to identify 10, 15, 20, 30 new skills that India can create at volume for ourselves as well as for the global market. I think if you look at unemployment rates in the US, I mean, they're the lowest ever. That means Mr. Trump does need more skilled people. And so I think the forces of nature are going to drive him to look for talent from outside. So I think these are 3 or 4 things which we should think about. There are new jobs that we can create, both high-tech as well as not in the high-tech areas. I think there's a bigger opportunity for us to partner with academia in a more holistic fashion so that we can make sure that we continue to show realistic growth, to Pawan's point, and otherwise it all looks like some bubble. Thank you.
Let's come back to the questions here. Thank you, Doctor. Let's come back to the challenges here. So if the questions can be crisp to the panel on what challenges they see that the panel here can respond to. I'm going to take a bunch of questions, comments, and then get the panel to react.
I have never seen more people ring me up every day and saying, can you find me a job, can you find me a job? I'm also reminded about the time when I was working in the north and Khalistan was happening. And my boss then told me that the energy of the Punjabi people or the Sikh people is more than what can be contained in the state of Khalistan. As long as there is going to be economic prosperity, divisiveness in the country can be overcome. I think the biggest danger that we see today is that if we don't make economic progress, if we don't create enough jobs, all the factionalism that we see between religions and castes and communities will only accelerate. That is my biggest fear.
Sailesh?
In my mind, creating a job today is less important than creating an entrepreneur. And if India can focus on getting more and more people into entrepreneurial activity, we would have done a great job. I just share with you that in rural Tamil Nadu, a woman who was not educated pulled out a smartphone and said, I use Google Pay. If that is the level that we have reached in terms of awareness about what is possible, there's a great deal of entrepreneurial potential. And I think we should stop looking at only jobs. We should think of creating a job as equivalent to creating an entrepreneur.
Rahul?
Thanks.
Rahul represents the British Deputy High Commission here in Bombay.
Thank you very much for that. Just a very brief question, which is, we talked about the quality of growth, and I think that's a very good way to look at it. What are your prescriptions for government and for business to address some of those risks?
The business part he already spoke a lot about, or the corporate, but the government part we will come to. Partha?
Just two quick points and then comment on it. One is IIP last 3-4 years have been languishing. Okay, we can say that there has been growth and people are not, but people are not saying growth because that IIP data showed that from 13 to 17 we probably came back to 13 levels in 17, and only last 6 months we saw some growth which has not gone up. So why should people feel that there is a growth when there is no growth? That's one question. The second one is that I was with some person who was giving data on the rural market and said rural, the actual MSPs minus inflation, the real value has gone down in the last 4 years by about 2 to 3% every year. And if that is so, actually there is more poverty than there was 4 years back on a real basis. And if there is any extra consumption, it's all coming from the rich, rural rich. So back to your disparity point. So what does this mean in terms of, in spite of all these schemes?
I'm going to request for a show of hands of questions before I go to the panel for comments. Okay, so I'll take this lady's question and then I'm going to come to you. Regroup the questions in some way. This lady here. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Swastika Basu. I'm Chief of Enterprise Risk Management from Tata Steel. I work
She's
with
from
Samita.
Jamshedpur.
Yeah, I've come from Jamshedpur. So first and foremost, my compliments to the panel for a very interesting panel discussion. So based on one of the points which was on data mining, which was said that's one of the key trends, I would like the panel to also dwell quickly on what is the chances of, or what is the risk of cyber insecurity. More and more data phishing, hacking, and also on business espionage, because, corporate fraud, that kind, because as we rely more and more on data, that risk also seems to be looming very large.
Okay, let me put the question slightly. I'm going to start with you, Andrew. A lot of emphasis on distribution of wealth, creation of opportunity, engaging the energetic youth. Obviously, the answers are employment, entrepreneurial opportunities, all of that. But realistically, how big are these? And then what can it manifest on?
It's a great question. A little bit outside my normal wheelhouse in some ways as well. I think the entrepreneurial point's a really interesting one, because I've found in my time here in India, I've been here for a bit over 2 years, that everywhere I go I meet entrepreneurs. Didn't happen as much when I was in China 4 years before that. Certainly didn't happen a great deal in Australia before that. So wherever I go, I find entrepreneurs setting up various shops, either coming to me as potential clients or talking to me as potential suppliers of services. I think one of the areas I touch on when we talk about the job discussion is something that I've noticed going to a lot of trade fairs and so on around, particularly data analytics, to kind of look at the data point a little bit there, which is the supply and demand of high quality, very intelligent graduates for these new technology fields and expanding the technology fields. The challenge is that a lot of those really top flight graduates want to leave. It's not that they want to leave because they don't want to be in India, it's just they can get phenomenally good money and phenomenally good jobs in Silicon Valley or in Australia or even New Zealand maybe. But someone touched on New Zealand before, I had to get that in. So, I mean, ultimately, there are these phenomenal opportunities that exist offshore. And I think one of the striking comments that I remember from a recent US trade event here in India was a gentleman from one of the technology companies who said he ticks all of the stereotypes for Silicon Valley. He's from southern India, has a high quality degree from IIT, and now lives in Silicon Valley. And it's kind of a striking comment, because what India really will need to do is attract that talent back, to retain that talent in India, to keep fueling the demand for those high-tech roles and that development of the high-tech sector, be it as entrepreneurs setting up their own shops or as people going into employment with different organizations.
Swastika, I'm going to take your question to the next session because that will have the risk professional. I'm going to bring Navneet in. The question from what is it that corporate can do, we spoke about. What is it governments can do and do different? Without, if I can put it in linear programming sense, if I can put a constraint function without stealing more from the future, either from climate or other resources.
I think you need to focus a lot more on, of course they are focusing, not that they are not. So I think a more inclusive and sustainable growth. I talked about the UBI, which makes me very positive on India. So I think right from the free LED, free toilets, free whatever, I mean some of those things. And on top of that, I think a medical insurance, a bank account, a pension, and a variety of those things will create that social safety net, security net, which will unleash the energy of those 300, 400 million people. And I think that will be very critical to ensure that the policies that need to be pursued for a sustained high growth will be supported by those people, because they can clearly see that I think if corporates make more money, if the government tax revenues go up, there is a direct benefit for me. And I think that needs to get communicated very, very well. One of the things that I think I get this feeling, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe Partha and all are better placed, that in our mindset we are becoming kind of an anti-profit. This reminds me of like when Nehruji said, Jamshed Tata in one of the meeting, that he said that this way we can make more profit, and he got very annoyed and he said, I hate the dirty word. I think look at telecom. I mean the mutual fund industry, the first guy made 700 crores and we hear that the large fund houses are making a lot of money. That's $100 million on managing $50 billion. There is something really wrong with us. We need to change that mindset. Unless you have a very large profit pools, then only it will attract more capital and more people to do the business. When you do that, distribute it rightly and do through whatever, I mean, through a better digital means that it doesn't get lost in transit. I mean, the money reaches the right person.
Very quickly, Sachin, I'm going to give you the final word. This conflict between demand of urban versus rural. I like food prices low, but that hurts farmers. What economic measures can government use to bring the right balance on things like these? Or, for example, savings, interest rate for savers versus borrowers.
I think one of the most important things in this is India's gotten locked into this 3 versus 4% problem, wherein the fiscal policy is locked in at 3%, the FRBM, which wants every single year the deficit to come down, which means that the fiscal stimulus for growth is actually coming down. So if you look at it from a 20-year, 30-year perspective, it peaked at say 19% of GDP, and now you're going down to very low single digits. The other is we've locked the monetary policy with a 4% inflation target. Now, in a dual kind of an economy such as India, the point that you make, rural versus urban, the point is that the farmer buys everything retail and sells everything wholesale. This kind of a monetary policy targeting and locking in your fiscal policy versus monetary policy will not work. I mean, look at how the Americans, people ridicule Trump, but he's been one of the first ones to realize that as monetary stimulus goes down in the US, he needs to kickstart the fiscal part. So I think only my wife and Trump understand Keynesian economics, and then they've started to realize that. But the point is simply this: if you're locking in your fiscal policy to a goal which is only getting lower and lower, and you are targeting inflation in a developing economy like India, which is fair bit of rural, and we know the numbers and the stats in terms of population, I think we are in for trouble. Something has to give way, and that is why it is manifesting into a lot of these issues that we see between the RBI and the central government. Going forward, I think this will continue to pose challenges because this is inherently unsustainable for an economy like India. The other thing that I want to say is what to do about it. I think we need to endeavor to make geography history. What I mean by that is what we are doing through GST, right, is something like that. We are making this into one single entity instead of so many. So look at industry, for example. Dr. Goenka referred to that. So you have your resources in that Bermuda Triangle of Poverty, Bihar, West Bengal and all that, right? All your resources are locked there. Your markets are in the west and your manufacturing is now north and south. Unless you integrate that, unless you make that geography history, you cannot become a competitive nation. And that poses a huge challenge, and that is why analysts talk about logistics costs and things like that. We will never be competitive if you do that. So I think GST is one good example. Taking that same example to agriculture, I think you'll talk about any single fruit or vegetable that you consume. Bulk of it, as much as 40-45% comes from one single place in India. So onions in Lasalgaon. I think there are n number of examples that I can give. Unless you do something about it, unless you make that problem history, you will not be able to circumvent that.
I think it was exactly 20 years ago when I was speaking on the internet coming in, I had used this expression, geography became history. But it's a very different usage altogether, and I like the way you bring that about one unified market, production place, industry, so that you can solve problems at a bigger scale. I invite the audience to join me in thanking what I think has been an excellent panel. Very insightful, very precise in their calls, mince no words. Trump actually has built a new fan club, I can see, out here. He called him Method and Madness. I think somebody in the audience had used Twitter in chief. Right? So I think Trump possibly has more fans here than in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much. We will take a short 15-minute break and regroup here for the session number 2. Thank you so much.